I saw a meme a couple weeks ago and it resonated with me in a way that made me laugh at first and then really question about what it means to me. It said, "How are you a loser in your own story?" And I sat with it because it's not mean, it's not a call out, it's genuinely asking something. If you're the main character of your own life, and I think most of us privately believe we are, then how are you losing? What is happening in the narrative that you're authoring where you, the protagonist, keep ending up on the floor? I've been thinking about this for weeks now, and the more that I think about it, the more I think the answer has almost nothing to do with effort or talent or luck. I think it has something to do with your agency, with whether you are actually in your own story or just watching it happen to you. So that's what this video is about. Not necessarily the meme, but what the meme is pointing at. Hi, welcome back to Angie's Tangents. If you're new here, I'm Angie. I make videos about culture, identity, and the way we move through the world, and why so many of us are losing in stories that we are supposedly writing ourselves. Before anything, I want to make a couple things clear. I don't think the main character thing is inherently stupid. There's something inherently useful about taking your own life seriously, about deciding what happens to you actually matters, that your interiority is worth exploring, that you deserve to be the subject of your own attention rather than always making yourself the supporting character in someone else's story. For a lot of people, particularly women, myself included, who come from cultures where self-erasure is the expectation, learning to center yourself is actually incredibly radical. In this day and age, we throw out the word narcissism so easily, but I think this is where we really need to redefine and relearn and find other words to describe things, because it inherently is not narcissism, it's survival. So I'm not here to ask you to shrink. I'm here to actually ask you a harder question. But here's where it actually starts to fall apart for me. The problem isn't centering yourself. The problem is performing self-possession without actually possessing a self. At some point in our lives, whether that be content that we actually seek or content that just shows up on our FYP, we've all seen it. Whether that's the carefully curated morning routine, the vision board, the "I'm the main character" caption over a video of someone walking dramatically through a parking lot or through an airport. None of that is bad, but none of that is a self either. We often think that a self is what you think when no one's watching. It's the opinion you hold that your friends would push back on. It's the choice you make that actually costs something. Aesthetic is what you project. Interiority is what you actually are. And I think, and I've been guilty of this too, that a lot of people have perfected the former while never really quietly developing the latter. An issue that came to mind relating to this when I was writing the script was something that I feel like a lot of people find uncomfortability in. And I can say this specifically for Indonesia. That example is voting. I've met a lot of people in my life, and some of them would be classed as smart or intelligent. The people who, when asked who they voted for, say some version of, "I just go with my family." Not because they've waited up, did their own research, or necessarily agreed, but because they've never really had to think about it. The system, the family, the culture, the community, it was always provided to them on a silver platter. And that's not even a political point. That's a self point. Because if you've never had a belief that cost you something to hold, that put you at odds with someone you love, that made you sit in discomfort, then what do you actually believe? Or more accurately, have you ever let yourself find out? An outsourced identity can look very confident from the outside. It has answers to everything, but it's very different when you realize that the answers are all just borrowed. With the current state of Indonesia, I know that it's a very sensitive topic for a lot of people, and I can confidently say that no, I did not vote for the current government, and I was actually vehemently against them. And during that time, I actually lost a lot of friendships or didn't pursue more relationships or friendships when I found out about the stance that they took or their explanations of choosing who they chose. Now, for context, I completely understand that not everyone has the privilege to have parents that encourage them to develop their own opinion or let their kids question them. But I think at some point, especially when you're an adult, and when it comes to things like this, you could only make excuses for so long. And whilst I understand that that fear can sometimes determine your safety or your livelihood, I genuinely feel that we need to sit in that discomfort and make decisions for ourselves. And what's really heartbreaking to me is that I met a lot of people who were educated and who had experiences or education that most people can only dream of. But I realized that sometimes that privilege can lead to complacency. And that is something that I really want people to question about themselves. Real people in your life are not NPCs, unfortunately. They have their own stories, they have their own pain, and they have their own interior worlds that are just as complex and valid as yours. And that even applies to family members. For example, the interior of my life is definitely different to my mom. Even though we essentially lived under the same roof for 25 years, the experiences that shaped her and the experiences that shaped me are entirely different. The moment you start treating their needs as an interruption to your own narrative, or the moment you stop being curious about who they really are, you essentially stop being a protagonist and become a solipsist. And yes, I just learned that word for this video. Main character energy without empathy is essentially just self-obsession with better branding. Whilst doing the reflection for this script, I noticed something that you may or may not disagree with, but it's something that I've been sitting with for a while because I think it explains why all of this is so much worse right now than it's ever been before. We essentially are the first generation to grow up with a social media infrastructure. Not as a novelty or an add-on. I think it's impacted us in a way that we can't really fully name yet. It made spectatorship our default mode. Think about what you actually do on your phone for most of the day. For me, anyways. I scroll, I watch, I observe other people living. I observe other people creating and other people having opinions and people experiencing things. And whilst it can be a good way to make us feel connected with one another, it all feels like participation. You're liking, you're sharing, you're commenting, you're consuming, but none of it is really action. None of it is you in your own life, making your own choices, building your own thing. It's so accessible and it becomes frictionless that it costs nothing and requires nothing of you. And when your baseline is frictionless, the actual texture of real life starts to feel abnormal. Building something feels slow. Relationships are complicated. Learning a skill feels frustrating before it feels good. Facing a hard truth is uncomfortable in a way that no amount of scrolling will ever be. And so we reach for the phone because of convenience and because the phone is always easier. But here's where it gets even more complicated. We're not just spectators because humans aren't just one thing. We're also performers. We watch each other, yes, but we still perform for watchers. We curate the feed, the caption, choosing the angle, and we decide what the narrative of our life looks like to an audience. And that performance takes up an enormous amount of energy that used to just go into living. So we're simultaneously watching everyone else and also managing what everyone else sees of us. Spectator and performer at the same time. And both roles keep you at one side and removing you from actually being present in your own life. The spectator isn't in the story, but neither is the performer, because the performer is always thinking about the audience rather than just existing. I mean, one thing that me and my friends always talk to each other about is doing it for the plot. And I think that the concept of the main character through this lens reframes everything. It came from a generation that spent so long watching and being watched that they forgot that they were supposed to be living. The main character aesthetic is actually a symptom of the problem. People find the concept of agency so foreign and that they have to remind themselves out loud on camera to be in their own life. And then they film it and post it for an audience. And I know you must think, wow, the irony is so rich. A girl who posts on social media doing her makeup and discussing this concept whilst her actually living in it. But I think that's sort of the point. The very act of performing, I'm the main character, keeps you in the performer role. You're still playing to the crowd, essentially. You're still managing perception. And what's funny is the most radical version of actually being the main character in your life is probably the one that you never post. And I personally think that this complacency, it seeps into everything. It makes us passive in our relationships, waiting for the other person to text first, to define things, to make the move. And it makes us passive in our careers, waiting to be discovered, waiting to be chosen, waiting for the opportunity to arrive. And it also makes us passive in our own growth, consuming endless self-improvement content without actually changing anything. Because consuming the content feels like you're doing the work. We have confused watching with doing for so long that doing now actually feels like an extraordinary act. And it is. That's the thing. In this environment, choosing to actually participate in your own life, to make the thing, send the message, have the conversation, or even take the risk is genuinely countercultural. It's swimming against a very strong current. But that current is also the reason that you're watching this video. So I personally think you already know which way you want to swim. Something that I realized that nobody talks about when it comes to main character energy is that it's a lot easier to center yourself when yourself was never uncomfortable or never in danger. Self-interrogation by genuinely asking, who am I, what do I believe, and what do I want, is not a luxury that everyone defaults to. For a lot of people, that process was forced. So for me, that was due to me moving in high school, by moving to a very privileged and predominantly white school. And this example can show up very interestingly by migration, or by being the only one in the room that doesn't look like anyone else, by holding two cultures at once and having to consciously choose what to keep from each one. And that is an act of survival. As I said before, I'm very proud of my Indonesian heritage, but saying that I'm purely Indonesian with no influences from anywhere else is a lie. Because if I actually compare with other people, for example, my cousins who spent their whole lives in Indonesia, it would be very different. I've never had the option of inheriting an identity just as it is. I had to build one myself out of parts that are sometimes contradicting or don't fit together in a country that wasn't really sure how to define me and what to see me as. And I know I sound like I'm complaining, but ultimately I realized that it's not a complaint, it's a gift. And coincidentally, the people who I've seen struggle the most with agency are the ones who've never had to develop any, who were handed a set of beliefs and identity, whether that be from family, class, culture, religion, and never had a reason to question it. And this made me realize that when nothing ever challenges your sense of self, you don't know what your self is made of. You just know it hasn't been tested. And it shows up in subtler places too. For me, it shows up around the expectations of marriage, for example. I'm only 25 and I feel the weight of a timeline that I didn't choose. The belief that marriage is an achievement to be completed rather than a relationship to be chosen. That settling, and just settling, is responsible, mature, what you do. And I understand where it comes from, because collective cultures protect their members through structure. That script exists because it's worked for a long time and for a lot of people. But I think a lot about shows, for example, like Married at First Sight or 90 Day Fiancé. And I know you might think, girl, that's reality TV, but we can still observe it while simultaneously taking it with a grain of salt. Because the premise of that show is literally, we will find you a compatible person based on data, and you'll marry them on camera before you've had even a single conversation. And millions of people, I don't because I don't really enjoy TV in general, millions of people root for the couples. And I think the reason that it resonates so deeply is because it externalizes something that a lot of people already feel. That the decision of who to marry should be handed by someone else, by experts, by the family, or even by the algorithm, by anyone other than the fact that the terrifying, vulnerable act and risk of choosing someone yourself and being wrong. Love is Blind does the same thing from the other direction. You fall in love without seeing each other, and then you have to decide if that love survives in reality. And what's interesting is how so many people on that show, when the relationship stops working, cannot leave, cannot say this isn't right and mean it, because they've already told everyone, because the wedding is already planned, everything's booked, because walking away means admitting that the choice, and it was their choice, was wrong. And I'm not saying I have all this figured out, marriage specifically. I'm still really young. I still get told at work I'm a baby, and I don't have everything figured out. And the reality is, I don't even see myself married until I'm at my 30s, earliest. Not because I don't want love, but I refuse to confuse urgency with readiness. The timeline that often says that you should be settled by now was not written for me, because it was written for a version of a life that I never signed up for. And if you've ever asked yourself what you actually want, if the question feels selfish or dangerous, then you are, in the quietest way, a loser in your own story. Not because you made the wrong choice, but because you never let yourself make one. And I want to put a disclaimer, because I think certain traditions like arranged marriages, and again, maybe I needed to do a separate video on arranged marriages, because I think people's definitions of understanding of what arranged marriages are seem very, very misconstrued. But I know that the lens that I'm operating on is a very Western and individualistic lens. And I'm not trying to discredit the history or the experiences of people who have had great marriages under arranged marriage. But the thing that I'm trying to do is to make people be honest with themselves and ask the question, is this something that I actually want for myself? Or is this something that I want so that other people can look at me and say, oh, that's good, or something that is solely done to make your parents happy? After all of that, it brings me to actually say what I want to say. There's a version about losing in your own story that's about not trying, not doing the work, and being passive. And that's a pattern that we can recognize easily. But there's also another version that's oftentimes sneakier and not really talked about. And I think that it's actually the more common one. It's the version where you're not passive, but you're invested. But what you're invested in is the identity of being held back. That heartbreak becomes a personality. And I'm not here to compare trauma, because this isn't the trauma Olympics, but you hear it all the time in the fact that heartbreak becomes a core aspect of your personality, or the difficult childhood becomes a permanent excuse. And how different circumstances, whether that be your family, the country, the timing, they become the reason as to why nothing ever changes. And I'm making sure to address this quite gently, because I'm not saying that your pain isn't real. I'm not saying that your circumstances don't matter. They do, because it's reality. Systemic barriers exist. Trauma is real, and as someone who's lived through it, I'm not interested in hustle culture poison that tells you everything is your fault. But what I am asking is, at what point did that wound become your identity? Because that's the quiet comfort in powerlessness. If your circumstances are the reason, then you're not responsible for the outcome. You don't have to risk trying and failing. You don't have to face the terrifying possibility that you had more agency than you let yourself believe. And my experience on it is something that I'm honestly still figuring out. When I was 21, I was in a relationship for a year and a half. And it was my first proper long-term relationship. And in that relationship, at the start it was nice, but towards the end, I want to say the 6 months, I kept going back. Not because I wanted to, and not because I was good, but it was because of the fact that I was scared of being alone. That was ultimately the truth that I refused to face, and how I was choosing a familiar discomfort over an uncertain freedom. And for that year, or for those 6 months, I dressed it up in other reasons. I told myself the story in ways that made me the person that things happen to, rather than someone making a choice. I eventually spent years single after that, partly because my standards are high, but mostly because I had to sit with myself long enough to actually know what I wanted, and to believe I deserve to wait for it. At this point in my life, I'm really not interested in situationships. And the reasoning is because I have a life that I built deliberately. Work I care about, friendships I've chosen, dreams I'm actively moving toward. And the idea of shrinking that to tick a box, to satisfy a timeline that was never really mine in the first place, and to settle is my biggest fear. To settle for someone who isn't reciprocal is just something that I can't do. Not because I'm better than anyone per se, but because I've worked on myself too hard to the point that I don't think I could ever betray that work. And I see my friends and the people that I love, and this isn't a call out to them, but I see them get their hearts broken again and again, over and over, by the same person. Partially because I think they've taken on the identity of being the saver or being the yearner in the relationship. The one who says that they're into toxic guys or toxic girls, or the one who proclaims that I can change him, or fall in love with avoidance. The one who loves people who leave. And I think about how much of our music is literally written from inside that identity. One of my favorite artists, and hurts me to actually say it, is SZA. and she's built an entire discography around it. And I say that with so much love because I have been to her concert and I was screaming my lungs out and it was one of the best moments in my life. But I often think about what we're actually singing along to, because whilst people often say it's not that deep, everything you verbalize goes to your subconscious mind. And when you sing it enough, or when you say it enough, you eventually believe it. We romanticize the yearning so completely that we forget we're allowed to want something that doesn't hurt. I mean, if you look at other artists like Olivia Rodrigo, Gracie Abrams, or Lana Del Rey, some of the most streamed music of our generation is about loving someone who is fundamentally unavailable. And again, I'm not criticizing the art because that music is honest and I love art. But it captures something real. But I think we have to ask ourselves, at what point does relating to a song become living in it? And at what point does the playlist become the personality? And I'm not here to call anyone out, but I know a couple people who have listened to Nicki's Back Burner and related to that. And to that I say, may Allah protect you all from ever relating to that song. Because here's what I've noticed. The yearner identity is seductive because it's inherently romantic. There's a whole aesthetic around it. The sad girl era, the crying in the car, the journaling at 2 a.m. It looks like depth. It looks like feeling things deeply. And feeling things deeply is something that's real and so beautiful. But there's a difference between someone who feels deeply and someone who has made their pain into a home. One of them is experiencing their emotions and the other one is curating them. And part of me deeply understands that. Because there's something almost addictive about a love that you have to earn. It feels like more because it costs more. The highs are higher and the lows are so low. And when you've only ever experienced love as something that you had to fight for, a love that's easy, consistent, reciprocal can actually feel suspicious, boring even. Like something must be wrong or you're waiting for the other shoe to drop. But cost isn't the same as value. And the truth underneath all of it is that sometimes we choose the pain because it's familiar. Because as one of the quotes of one of my favorite movies, The Price of Being a Wallflower, we accept the love we think we deserve. Because an uncertain shot at something real is scarier than guaranteed heartbreak that we already know how to survive. And unfortunately, so the story stays the same. Because nothing changes if nothing changes. A couple weeks ago, I actually saw a tweet that was sort of the catalyst for making this video. And I'm not talking about the aesthetic growth, I'm talking about real growth. Is directly proportionate to your ability to face truths without running away from them. And that sounds so simple, but I want you to think about how often you've known something, like really known it, in your body, in that quiet part of you that doesn't lie. And choose to not look at it directly, because looking at it meant having to do something about it. And doing something about it meant risking something. I believe that truth has a cost, and that's why we often run away from it. And running looks different for everyone. Some people stay busy, filling every hour so there's never enough silence for the thing that you're avoiding to surface. For some people, it's the opposite. Paralysis, the scrolling, the endless consuming of other people's lives so you don't have to look at yours. For some people, it's self-medication, or a relationship that isn't right but is at least a distraction, or a career path that you know doesn't fit you, but at least it's a path. That's why I've never believed in that saying that humans aren't creative, because the reality is we are extraordinarily creative when it comes to not looking at the thing that we need to. I mean, I was a culprit for years. During my 3rd year in university, I sort of realized that what I was studying wasn't right for me. I was at a very, very well-known university and doing a double degree, but the reality was I was miserable in a specific way. You're only miserable when you're performing a version of yourself for other people's comfort. It's important to note that the reason that I was doing that was because obviously my parents had expectations and my culture had a script. And I had a quiet yet very persistent voice in my head telling me that you're supposed to pursue something different. I mean, what I'm studying now, digital social media, was not the Indonesian daughter move. And I know that. And I went through a real period of questioning and depression because I had to find conviction in myself before anyone else was going to give it to me. I had to face the truth that fulfillment to me matters more than prestige. That I would rather be genuinely good at something I love than technically impressive at something that hollows me out. What's crazy is no one gave me permission for that. I had to really figure that out on my own, and I had to give it to myself even when the circumstances around me wasn't necessarily supportive. And then there's also YouTube, this channel. I've been told my whole life by multiple different people that I have the gift of communication and that it was always something that I needed to pursue. And I've made videos for years, decades, some serious, some not. Not because the video in itself wasn't ready, but because I wasn't ready to be seen. Even when I was routinely making content over on TikTok and Instagram, when I was doing makeup videos, I never spoke. I stayed behind the edit, behind the aesthetic, and behind everything except my actual voice. The truth I was running from was so simple yet terrifying. And that truth was that I wanted to be seen. And I was scared of what would happen if I was. Facing that truth didn't make it less scary. It just made staying hidden less impossible. And I think about this context of social media more broadly, because we live in the era of the personal brand, the curated feed, and the highlight reel. And there's this really interesting paradox where we have more tools than ever to be seen, and more people than ever using the tools to hide. You can be on Instagram every single day and never once say anything true. You can have thousands of followers but zero vulnerability, and you can perform being known without actually ever being known. And that feels safe, because if people only ever see the version that you control, the good lighting, the right angle, the caption you rewrote 4 times, then they can't reject the real thing because they never saw it. I've learned that the version of you that the internet falls in love with online, when it's curated to the point of falseness, will never actually satisfy you. Because you'll always know, deep down inside, even if you don't admit, that they're loving the performance. And there will always be a part of you wondering what would happen if they saw the unedited version. The one that's scared and the one that doesn't have it all figured out yet. And that's the thing about truth facing. It doesn't remove the fear, because fear will always be there. It removes the excuse. And once the excuse is gone, you have to decide who you actually are. Someone who acts despite the fear, or someone who keeps running and calls it waiting for the right time. I don't mean to be the party pooper, but the reality is there is no right time. There is only the moment that you decide that the truth matters more than the comfort of avoiding it. If you haven't noticed already, I scroll a lot on Twitter and sometimes I find a lot of gems within that app, even though most of the time it's a little bit cursed. I came across a post that said, "No one's coming to save you," and I bet you probably heard that one before. It's a little bleak and a little motivation, I guess, but it's true. No Prince Charming is coming to save you from the tower. The person who's gonna fix your life, validate your choices, or give you permission to begin is never gonna come. But the second part of that tweet said, "No one's coming to stop you either." The same absence that makes the first part terrifying makes the second part enormous. You have more room than you think. And whilst the obstacles are real, the permission that you're waiting for, you'll never get it. Because no one, and I repeat, no one, has the authority to give it to you except you. Your circumstances don't define your worth. And I really want that to land. If you don't take anything away from this video, I hope you remember that one. The family that doubted you, the relationship that broke you, and the opportunity that didn't come, none of that is the final word of what you're capable of. None of that is the ending. It's just the part of your story that happened before you are given the choice to write it differently. I don't know about anyone else, but I would rather try something and fail spectacularly at it rather than live my whole life in the safe harbor of I never really had the chance. Because at least in failure, you were present and you were in the story. You were doing something with the time. Failure is not the opposite of a good story. A character who never fails, never risks, never changes, never met with adversity is not a protagonist. That's a statue, and statues don't have arcs. A real protagonist doesn't wait for the plot to happen to them. They make choices. They fail, they learn from failure, and they change. That's where the character arc usually is. Not a glow up, not an aesthetic shift, not a new morning routine. It's a change that actually cost something. The main character narrative actually only works if you're willing to be the person in the story who gets it wrong, who sits in the discomfort, and who faces the truth that they've been avoiding. And the one who keeps going anyway. Not because it's easy, but because the alternative is to be the person who had a whole life and spent it watching from the side. Resilience looks different on everyone, but one thing that really resonated with me that I read again about on Twitter was the fact that the saddest parts of you kept going. And I think that's a beautiful reminder of the capability that you have and hold within yourself about coming back from something that you thought wasn't possible. So, after all this, how are you a loser in your own story? And maybe you're not. Maybe you're doing exactly the thing, facing the truth, making the choices, sitting with the discomfort, and building the life. And if so, keep going. And I know that's so simple to say, but that's the most genuine thing that I feel like I'd like to hear if I was in your position, and the only thing that I can give you. But if there's a part of you that heard something in this video and felt a little called out, apologies. But it wasn't by me. It was by yourself. And I think that's something that's worth sitting with. Not to punish yourself, not to spiral, just to ask honestly. What would it look like if I took authorship seriously? Not the aesthetic, not the caption, the actual messy, accountable, sometimes embarrassing work of being the person who shows up in their own life. I encourage you to explore, to learn to fail, and to let go of the identity that's been keeping you safe but keeping you small. And stop waiting for someone or something, whether that be a partner, a parent, a better set of circumstances, or a better version of yourself to come and change the story for you. Because the reality is, nothing changes if nothing changes. And you don't have to be the hero, you just have to be in the story. So, that is it for my video today. I hope you enjoyed it. I actually have to go for a dinner. So I hope you enjoyed the video today, and if you didn't and watched this far, I thank you anyway, and I really hope it resonated with you and you can take something away from it. Please don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and share it to someone who you think will enjoy. And yeah, and so let me know your thoughts, whether you agree or disagree, and even your experiences, because that's the beauty of the human journey, that we can share and encourage each other. So I hope you're having a wonderful day or night and wherever you're watching, and stay healthy and take care of yourself, and I'll see you soon.